I'm here with Dr. Xavier Perez. He's a criminology professor over at Depaul University. He joins me here on the Can We Please Talk podcast. Dr. Perez, Mike Leon, good to meet you, my friend.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
First, for our audience that's not familiar with you, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what made you want to get into criminology.
Well, I grew up in Chicago, so growing up in Chicago, you get to sort of experience the criminal justice system pretty firsthand. And so I would say that my experiences with law enforcement, with the courts, were really representative of like mass incarceration. And so friends and family members who were involved in the criminal justice system just kind of made me want to be involved in some capacity, studying crime and finding solutions, alternative solutions to some of the ways in which we punish. We're a very retributive society, so I explore ways in which we could maybe humanize the criminal legal system.
That is very well said. I feel a lot of that as growing up in the Bronx, New York, and kind of seeing the way things have played out with family members of mine in the criminal justice system there in New York. I want to get to a bunch of different things just off of that. Follow up on that, because you wrote about police behavior and community relations. Specifically, I was reading something from the ACLU about the police report that happened with the police department findings from the DOJ investigation a while back. Excessive and lethal force against civilians, especially in poor and black neighborhoods and Dominican communities. Violent suppression of peaceful protesters using batons. This was back in the 60s, obviously. Failure to protect victims of domestic violence and investigate reported crimes of rape. When we talk about policing overall, what are some of the issues with policing? Like, why, to your overall point, you mentioned about the criminal justice system and the way it's played out. Can you give our people a 30,000-foot overview as to why policing is the way it is right now across the U.S.?
I would look at two sort of perspectives. I would look, one is the policing profession, and then I would look at their relationship with communities, particularly communities of color. So when I think about the profession, I think about it's almost an unrealistic expectation of police officers by the public. I don't think that the public is aware of how stressful that job is, and to the extent to which police officers commit suicide, the extent to which police officers engage in alcoholism and domestic abuse. So I think there needs to be this sort of understanding and reckoning with the sort of pressures that police departments face in many of these communities that are underserved, underfunded. They become the front line against many of society's ills. And instead of addressing those ills, we naively and maybe in some sense short-sightedly expect the police to solve those problems. When it comes to community, so that's a different conversation. Right. I think historically we've used law enforcement as a tool of power against certain communities. And so in those ways, I think about policing as a force that socially controls certain groups and polices the social boundaries of certain groups. And so they become the first line of that sort of war. When we speak about the war on drugs and the war on poverty, we always seem to have these wars that we fail.
Right.
The police become those sort of first foot, like the soldiers out there who are fighting that war. And in many of those instances, I would say that those wars and policies were not implemented by police, right? They were implemented by politicians of the time period. Right. And so the police are now, again, forced to deal with those issues. And it's just a long-standing history. I mean, you think about like the early origins of policing, whether they are to control the class, urban unrest of the 1800s, or whether they are the slave patrols of the South. The history of policing in American society is particularly problematic.
I want to follow up on that because there's just so much there. And I was telling you this off air. We talked about a piece that aired back in 2021 that you were a part of with a bunch of other Depaul professors, talking about this post George Floyd world and the whole messaging around defund the police. And you mentioned something. I like divert funds from the police, right? Like in a functioning society, and I'm paraphrasing what you said, but in a functioning society, we wouldn't ask this much of police departments, et cetera. Defund the police has become such a buzz phrase, and we're going to get into political messaging and how it's kind of playing out with immigration, with respect to other things. But you hear defund the police, your first reaction is?
In some ways, I don't know. I feel like it's, if we're going to talk about abolition of police, then let's talk about abolition. If we're talking about diverting financial resources, then let's do that. I feel like defunding the police doesn't fully capture either of those. It's almost like the middle of the road that doesn't really capture both of the sentiments. Right. I would, in referring to that article, what I was arguing was that when you look at middle class communities, the police and the criminal justice system are not the major source of funding in those communities. If you have problems, you have other community resources that deal with it. If you have some sort of issues within the school, it's the school that has resources to deal with it. If we're gonna look at how society should look like, ideally the criminal justice system should be a very small part of it. The rest of the social services, mental health, homeless, and some of the other concerns that we have, the police were never equipped to deal with those issues. I think as a society, unfortunately, what we've done is we've turned our back against marginalized working class communities of color. And in place, instead of answering those sort of calls for help, we've provided them with the criminal justice system as the only solution. So what I am particularly critical about is that when we think about how do we solve crime in society, we can't think about anything else other than policing and the criminal justice system because we've never been given the other options. Right. So we just lack the creative imagination to think about other solutions to punishment or to crime in our society, but punishment.
If a politician, let's say tomorrow, reaches out to you and says, "Hey, I heard you on the Can We Please Talk podcast." Shout out to them for listening to it. Or I read something that you wrote about, and I want to message to the public similar to what you're saying right now. It's not about defunding. It's about, diverting funds, investing in other programs that help people with mental health issues and things like that, holding police officers accountable. What are some ways that you would message to them of how they should message to the public?
I think fundamentally we want the same things. We want to reduce crime and make society a safer place. I think there are different ways to achieve that. And what the last 40 plus years of the war on crime and tough on crime policies have just been an utter failure. I mean, when you look at the crime rates in comparison to other Western societies, particularly when you look at incarceration rates, we incarcerate more people than any of the Western societies. And so the fundamental question I think we need to ask is, how do we arrive at that place of safety in different approaches? Because what we've tried, and I often hear that as a sort of a comment, like we need to be tougher on crime, we need to lock up people. And I always ask, to what extent? We incarcerate more than any of our sort of colleagues, the Western societies, and we still have far more greater crime rates than they do. So I just feel like that message, I understand where it surfaced in the 70s and 80s, but today, some 40 plus years, we understand that message did not solve crime. Right. And in many ways only made situations worse because we've decimated communities of color through the criminal justice system.
Well, let's get into communities of color. Perfect transition there. Because, what are you, by the way, nationality-wise?
Ecuadorian.
Ecuadorian, okay. So I'm half Puerto Rican, half Cuban. The Latino vote is something that is, of great importance to me, obviously to you as well. When you hear the Latino vote and you see programming this is about the Latino vote, what are some things that come up for you feelings or emotion-wise as people try to capture what the Latino vote encompasses without understanding how multi-layered it is?
So I think of a couple of things, right? The first thing I think about is almost a commodification, right? So I think about, in ways, how can maybe marketers tap into that market to gain some sort of economic advantage. The same thing that you can make the argument for politicians, that politicians are looking to capture the Latino vote to kind of win some elections. I think I don't mean to be too cynical in this, but the questions that I feel they fall short is, how do we address the structural issues that are present in those communities? Right. How do we address the nuances of those communities? We understand that, for example, as you mentioned, Puerto Rico has a very different experience than does Cuba, which has a very different experience than Mexico and Venezuela. So there's this sort of like all the groups are sort of homogenized in some way. Like we fall under one broad umbrella of Latinos, but we have to recognize that each one of us has a different history, different experience of why we migrated to the U.S., and that has to be recognized as well.
You know, I'm going to ask you a few more questions on the Latino vote specifically, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up, I remember you wrote something or you were featured in a piece relating to the way Latinos are portrayed in media. We did some focus group research a while back asking Latinos a similar question. When you see, you know, a Latino character or a Latinx character on television, are they portrayed accurately? Are they not portrayed accurately? You wrote something similar about, if you notice the crime shows, a lot of the folks that are portrayed as committing the crimes are blacks and Hispanics, right? Can you kind of expand on that, the way Latinos are actually portrayed in media and how the characterization is wrong?
Right. So actually, I teach a crime films class in which we speak about this at length. I think, you know, these are the popular images that just reinforce stereotypes. And unfortunately, these are the popular images that sell. So when we think about films, when we think about TV shows, particularly news coverage, it depicts Latinos in a very negative way. Not to suggest that crime isn't present there. Crime is certainly present in the community, but crime is just a very small part of the Latinx experience. There's certainly other areas that have a lot more significance than just crime. And so I always, when we think about the portrayal of Latinx groups, it's very narrow, and in many ways it reinforces very stereotypical notions about family, about honor, about violence, about sort of traditional versus modern. Those have been around for decades. And so I think one thing that particularly concerns me is that when we have this negative portrayal of Latinx groups, when you come into court or when they come into the criminal justice system, then they're working against the stereotype, right? And so that, unfortunately, is something that continues to persist today.
You know, you are feeding up into these follow-ups perfectly. I don't know if it's on purpose or for Jordan and Pippin here in Chicago. Latinx, boy, that term, I don't know. There's something about it, but I want the expert opinion on this. The term Latinx, can you explain that terminology? Because in the focus group research I've done with folks under a certain age, I've gotten a lot of, I've never heard of that term. What is that term? And then you see polling data around Latinx, and it polls pretty high where people don't want to use that term to be bottled in, right? They'd rather Latino or Latina or even Hispanic, right? Can you kind of explain that terminology and where Latinx kind of came from?
Okay, so Latinx is really just a term that's supposed to not be gender binary, right? So when we think about Latino and Latina, which is the term that I grew up when I was young, they're very much the binaries of gender, both male and female, and you're supposed to have all the characteristics of what it means to be man and what it means to be a woman. And so then the X kind of does away with the gender binary. You're familiar that in Spanish, you could have 500 women in a room, and you put in one male in there, and all of a sudden it becomes a male sort of term, right? And so there's this deliberate attempt to try to break down from the gender binaries. I find that a small percentage of the population identify as Latinx. There's still a lot of growth and a lot of ways to maybe for us
growing.
to educate people. I find that when we speak about immigrants, they identify as Hispanic because to them it's part of the assimilation process in America. You know, they probably think about maybe this is their home now, so they want to be American. Immigrants want to be American, you know. And so that it's not surprising that when we poll immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, that, they've never heard of Latinx. They probably never heard of Latino or Latina. They've been accustomed their whole life to hearing Hispanic.
Boy, I'm telling you, I'm Alex Caruso and you're Zach Levine, slamming it down. These follow-ups are perfect because you just mentioned migrants, immigration. It's a huge topic right now. In our last episode, we've been examining the midterms And a lot of the debates that are happening now, whether it be in Ohio, Pennsylvania is getting set for one with Dr. Oz and then John Fetterman, Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock are getting set to have a debate. Everything is around immigration and migrants. I mentioned to you off air, I live in Florida and I see a lot of ads with Governor DeSantis and a woman who's talking about crime that happened to her family based on somebody that came here illegally. Can you dispel some of these notions in terms of migrant crimes overall? Are migrant crimes at an alarming rate, or based on data that you're seeing? Can you talk about holistically, the kind of tropes that is negative in these ads about the way migrants are committing crimes at these alarming rates, that maybe the numbers just don't bear that out?
I think that's a great question, and it's a great opportunity for us to challenge those myths about immigration and crime. The first place I would look at is all the evidence suggests that foreign-born populations have a lower crime rate than native-born populations. That would be the first place I would have us to look at. I think it's important, when I look at immigration and crime, I look at the positives of immigrants. And in many ways, immigrants, when they arrive in cities, they come to work. And so they bring the ethic of work with them. In many ways, immigrants, as they're following these networks throughout America, traveling from one end of the country to the other, they're stimulating those social networks and those informal social controls. What we find is that, and this is what the evidence suggests, is that when immigrants move into communities, they actually, by stimulating those informal social controls, and you think about all of the ways in which immigrants work, that they actually decrease crime. I would suggest the complete opposite to that. If you want to deal with crime, if you want to reduce crime in the community, introduce immigrants, because immigrants have revitalized the economy and they continue to do so. It's fun, we're at a Catholic institution. Immigrants have saved the Catholic tradition in American society, right? So you could go on in areas outside of my expertise in which immigrants continue to just energize America. So I would say the concerns regarding immigration and crime are nothing new. We've had these concerns from the past. There's always going to be somebody who commits crime in any community, in any class level. For us to isolate those small instances and make those representative of everyone, then that's just not accurate, and it's misleading. What you find is that crime does occur in immigrant communities, but it's considerably lower than it does in native-born groups. And then when I think about it too, is like when we think about crime, it's very concerning that when you have crime and immigration connected, because when we think about criminals, these drug lords, these smugglers, human smugglers that bring people into the country, those are criminals, right? So if we're going to talk about crime, then let's separate those individuals. Right. The people that come here to work, to add to the American social fabric, the ones that want to be American, the ones that are learning English, the ones that are raising their children here to be American, the ones who are fighting for this country abroad in its wars, they are sacrificing. So those individuals, I think we need to treat differently and embrace them as Americans. But I would certainly address the individuals that are transporting drugs, human smuggling. That's a different group, and those are the ones that we should isolate and treat as as the crimes that they've committed. But the other group I would definitely treat differently.
If somebody's watching this and they say, "Boy, that guy's bright. What books is he reading to learn not only about community policing and criminology, which is your study? What are some books that you have read that you would recommend to people if they want to research some of this stuff?"
Well, the sort of crimigration is the topic. So I would I encourage people to just kind of do a Google search of crimigration, because that is the discussion that we've seen since the 80s of the nexus of immigration law and criminal justice. Right. Immigration law is a federal crime in which the criminal justice system at the state and local level just have no business working together. And so what the federal government has done over the last 40 plus years is incentivize local municipalities to go after immigrants. And so when we see this war on drugs particularly impact the African American community, alongside, we've seen this war against immigration and us become more punitive. In the past, it was just unconscionable to think that we would deport people. It was unconscionable to think that we would separate a father from his family while he waited for the hearing to play itself out. You know, in the past, we did have, if somebody committed a crime, certainly there were efforts to deport that individual. But if it was a minor crime, then this idea of just exporting people out and kind of expelling them from America was just not the American tradition. That is only a more recent phenomenon.
Well, Dr. Perez, it's been a pleasure talking to you today, my friend. Depaul.edu if you want to register for one of Professor Perez's classes here. I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program today. Continued success to you. Stay safe, and a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you for your time.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.